I imagine that especially after the first few, they use them kind of as a testing ground for new talent and stuff. Is that the case, or how exactly did the dynamic work? And who was working on the short versus two?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So the portfolio films were all made by John Lasseter and the same team of people. They brought back the short film with Jerry's Game, which went before Bug's Life, and that was a new director. So the jury is out on why to make a short film in the first place. They make the studio no money, but it's a tradition they have upheld. So you're right. It is a testing ground for new talent. It is a testing ground for new technology, but less so than you would think. Blue Umbrella is one of the few examples actually recently of distinct new technology being tested in the short film, and the global illumination system was something they used in Monsters University. So the way it works is really cool, actually. They have open calls for short film ideas, and you could be anyone in the company, but as long as you come to them with 3 different story ideas to pitch, they'll listen, and that's where they get their ideas. So that's been in place, I think, since Jerry's Game, I think a little bit later, but Blue Umbrella was one of them. The pitch was actually, director Sasha Unseld went around San Francisco and took pictures of faces he found in the everyday world, so basically the introduction you saw. But other films I studied were also from those open calls, so you get both directors, but you also, their sound guy, Gary Rydstrom, did one. Yeah, just a huge variety of people do them, so hope that answers the question. Yeah.
How did you go about choosing which shorts you used as your case studies?
Okay, so that was fun, because I did watch all of them. As I said, I kind of grouped them by emotional reaction. The portfolio films were easy because there are not too many of them. The only one I left out was called Andre and Wally B, which is their first one, but it was actually technically made by Lucasfilm Graphics Division, not Pixar. Same team, different brand. But that's a more cartoony, less emotional, so I decided to start with Luxo. The way it panned out, it usually was, I picked one film that was kind of very basic, so they mastered the skills they needed but didn't do much more. So when I talked about comedy, I talked about Knick Knack, which was another portfolio film, but this is an excellent example of basic gag structure, but doesn't really have super appealing characters, but people have debated me on that. But then I looked at Lifted, which adds another layer of emotions, but is still kind of not a fully developed character. So you have a sympathetic character, but not a fully developed one. And then I looked at Presto, which is this incredibly wonderful work of art, and I highly recommend you watch it and watch the commentary, because it's this intricate relationship with a character art on top of a cartoon gag structure. So that was how I kind of structured most of it, which was start basic and then pick 2 examples of them evolving over time. And so that actually covered most of the short films. I didn't leave out too many. The ones I ended up leaving out were ones that kind of didn't fit neatly into one of those categories I outlined. Also, I didn't do any of the films based off of features, because a lot of those are kind of, again, more cartoony, a little bit more just inserted as a DVD extra, whereas the short films released in theaters are a little more concrete and an art form in and of themselves. So, yeah. Sarah.
I know that you included the married life montage from
Yeah.
Us. What about your decision to do that? And also, I guess more generally speaking, like the relationship, if there is one between like the content of the shorts and the features.
So Scott can attest to this. I was very stubborn about trying to include stuff in the features for a long time in my thesis. It ended up being that I ultimately talked about the married life montage up in my conclusion. At one point, I even had an idea where I was going to choose a sequence from features to include in every single one of my chapters. So this is a sequence that shows them mastering comedy, or this is a sequence that shows them mastering heart. Just because I think one of my big points was that all these things that I have highlighted in these shorts can be found in the features and were proven and developed in the shorts. They show them over time. And so I think they're intricately tied, and you can see a lot of the same developments. So the Up montage was a treat to go back and look at after my thesis, because it is 4 minutes long, there is no dialogue, it uses expressive landscapes, and it uses small details. If you have a lot of time on your hands, I suggest you go and sit down and watch it frame by frame, because some of Ellie's expressions that fly by are priceless. But anyway, that's off topic. But so I think that you see a lot, not only of the strategies in the features, but you also see mini short films within the features. So Jessie's song in Toy Story 2 is a really good example. Technically, the first 20 minutes of WALL-E are a short film. Short films are defined as less than 40 minutes, so I can count that. Usually, when they get into worlds without dialogue, that's when they're using these strategies. So, yeah.
You talked about at the beginning, you mentioned Pixar as sort of has this distinct, almost couture quality. How do you think that happens in a company that's so collaborative?
So there's a really great book called Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull. Highly recommend it. But so, like I said, there's a core group of artists. John Lasseter has been there since the very beginning. Ed Catmull has been there from the very beginning. And they are hugely involved in every single film that gets put out. So there are a couple of key things about Pixar that make them self-contained. They don't take any outside pitches. They only get their story ideas only come internally. It's literally written on the website. It's great. So they don't take any outside ideas. They have a corporate structure where when you get hired, they really want you to stay. They don't put you under a contract because they want everyone to want to be there. But they will try to foster talent and keep them around. So you'll see the same names popping up again and again. Lee Unkrich, who directed Toy Story 3, was in there for a while. Brad Bird obviously comes back and works with them a lot. So just by keeping the same people around, they keep us the same vision and the same strategies, as well as they own their films. Like, Disney owns them, but all the tech for their films is done internally, all the editing, all the construction, everything is done internally. They don't get outside contractors to do anything. So they just have incredible control over their productions, and because they have the control and the same people, they function very much like an old Hollywood studio as opposed to a modern day studio.
Granted that Pixar is owned by Disney, how would you say, because you watched their shorts from the
Yeah.
How would you say Disney's characteristic form of storytelling has influenced them specifically?
Okay, cool. So the brief corporate history with Disney is that Disney has always distributed their films, not their early shorts, but starting with Toy Story, it's always been distributed by Disney, but they were not, in fact, owned by Disney till 2006, and that was a big controversial decision. So they are an independent entity. Disney, so a lot of the artists that work at Pixar were trained at Cal Arts. They recruit a lot from there, and Cal Arts, their professors were former Disney animators. So a lot of the people who work there are huge Disney fans. And like Ed Catmull claims his two biggest heroes were Walt Disney and Albert Einstein. And Disney has a huge influence on them. But what's cool about Pixar is that because they're independent, they don't have to be like Disney animation where they have to like honor this big long tradition. They can be who they are, and they also don't have to react against or try not to be Warner Brothers. So they can bring in and try to be Looney Tunes at the same time as being a Disney film, which I think makes them a little bit, I find them more fun to watch than like if you went back and watched Disney Silly Symphony, which is a little more sentimental, has a little less humor. So they become this kind of cool hybrid point. It was controversial when Disney took them over because it looks like, oh, big corporate company gonna come in and switch everything. But it was kind of the opposite in many ways, because when Disney took them over, Disney was in this really strange transition period where they were getting rid of a CEO kind of no one liked anymore, and who had a really rocky relationship with Pixar, because instead of working with them, he kind of threatened them and threatened to not steal their characters. Disney owned their characters, but used them against Pixar's will. So when they switched CEOs, Bob Iger, the new CEO, actually came and asked John Lasseter and Ed Catmull to become both chief creative officer and president, not only of Pixar, but of Disney Animation. So they're doing both right now. So if anything, Pixar has almost influenced Disney Animation more than vice versa, but there's obviously the long history. So does that answer your question? Rachel.
I haven't seen all the short Pixar films or the feature films actually, but there seems to me like Luxo Jr. before I knew his name, I thought it could be a girl. So I'm just wondering like why there seems like how they come off as male or female, and like there seems to be this male protagonist theme throughout.
So that has been a controversial thing regarding Pixar, is they're kind of predominantly masculine protagonists. And what's kind of cool about Luxo, which you pointed out, is they're not really gendered. I call them male because of, sadly out of convenience, but also because of the junior, and so it was able to, so that was able to simplify things a bit, and also because I tend to think of it very much as John Lasseter's movie, and John Lasseter's movie about the way he relates to the world, and so I kind of see it as his view as a parent. And that's a lot of where I think the male protagonist issue becomes an issue, is that they have a predominantly, or they used to, and there are men and women working, but they have predominantly male directors and writers. And because I think they're kind of searching for this truth in the world, and they're telling incredibly personal stories, they usually tell stories from their point of view, which is male. But I also think that the female characters in early Pixar films especially are underestimated, and they have a lot of ensemble casts that, while Woody and Buzz might be the names you remember from Toy Story, they're really ensemble pieces. And so characters like Jessie provide the emotional heart of the film and have almost the more complicated arc. So they haven't lost a female voice there. And what is also kind of cool about a lot of these is that they are ambiguous when it comes to gender. You can assign whichever gender you want, or no gender at all. That's kind of one of the benefits of inanimate objects coming to life. That was always a hard thing to figure out when I was writing.
Okay, this is sort of a big question, so bear with me. I remember there was this video, you may have seen it, of Steve Jobs in 1995 introducing Toy Story and sort of calling it a turning point in cinema. He's saying like 100 years later they have the first computer synthetic film, and it made me think, you know, like, can you point out to, like, what do you think are maybe the biggest influences that Pixar has had on the film industry, either technologically or creatively? I don't know.
Cool. I like that question. So I haven't seen that video, but that's really cool, and now I'm going to look it up. But it was a huge turning point. It was a huge deal when it came out because, like I said, first computer generated. So I think that one thing that's cool about Pixar is they're very free with their technology, or they used to be. They're a little cagier about it now because the industry has changed. But they have they sold computers originally, and they did work in special effects. Peter Jackson has cited their influence, and just by integrating engineers and artists, I think they have a huge impact because they are been able to, as they talk about it, I'm rambling, but so one cool thing about the early shorts is that it was John Lasseter, the animator, and a room full of engineers. And so Ed Catmull talks about when it was just a room full of engineers trying to make a movie, they couldn't do it because they didn't know, they didn't go to film school, they hadn't studied film, they couldn't get characters to have personality, so it was just like, look at this cool thing I can do. Then they brought John Lasseter in and he told a story. So I think, but at the same time, it's that John Lasseter quote about art and technology. They influence each other. So while he was able to influence them, he was also able to guide their technology so that the technology fit the art. He could be like, this is what I need from you, and then they have a new advancement. So the tight integration, I think, is huge, so that you see the worlds aren't separate anymore. So the technology that artists actually need is being made, and they're willing to share that. I think that they have raised the standard of animation. That's always, again, kind of a weird, complicated history that's mostly dominated by Disney. But Disney is always kind of having this ebb and flow of quality. Like, you see the Disney Renaissance, but then you see Home on the Range, and then you see them come back, and then you have Frozen and Big Hero 6, so they're kind of on this upward trend, but they also have a very defined view of the world. And I think Pixar has this level of craftsmanship that actually kind of proves that they're not just kids' movies, that you can approach them with the same level of detail and with the same level of care. Like, I think that of all the animated studios, with the exception of some of the foreign studios, which is kind of a huge other issue to deal with, but I think they are the most likely to produce a film considered for adults. But again, that's kind of a hairy issue. But they have raised that standard and kind of brought animation back into this new light, which I think was drastically needed. And it became so that when they first came out, they actively said, I do not want any songs I don't want any bursting into songs. I mean, maybe they have Randy Newman and he's great, but but they don't have any bursting. It's not a musical. It's not a fairy tale. It's this kind of new form of storytelling. So I think that's been a huge influence. And I think the technology side, which is something I need to do more research in, but I think there's been a lot of kind of background influence on the special effects world. So that answer your question?
Yeah.
Gabrielle?
Flipping through the Pixar shorts in my mind, Bounding is the only one that I can think of that really uses spoken word. I'm sure that I'm forgetting something. But, you know, even going through things that are not based around inanimate objects, even things like Presto or Lifted, there tends to be a tradition of silent storytelling in these short films.
Yeah.
And you said yourself that the parts of Pixar features that feel like short films tend to be the ones that are like 4 minutes without dialogue. Is that something that's kind of a like, have you found anything that's like a rationale for why that is, or do you have any idea on like why they tend to have that policy around their short films? Or preference?
So I can't think of like a company policy, but I definitely, my own personal opinion, I feel like that's where they can use their detail best, so they can have things like Luxo's Wiggle, which I think says a lot more than if like Luxo was speaking baby talk or something like that. But so that it helps to look at films like Bounden, which for reference for those who haven't seen it, it's completely narrated to a song, so it's not actual give and take dialogue. But when I was looking at Bounden, what disappointed me in a weird way was that they have this really expressive film that gets to the climax, and the climax is all a conversation. He learns his lesson because this jackalope appears out of nowhere and tells him how to live his life. And it was like, and then he learns to rebound. And I think by eliminating the action bit, it's just a little less deep. You don't kind of feel it the way you feel things when Blue Umbrella is coursing around, flying around, surpassing object after object to prove his love. It's a kind of like, you become more emotionally invested when you are experiencing something with the character as opposed to them saying stuff. So the only other film that has spoken word in it is Day and Night, which is a weird spoken word. They have a radio guy speaking at the end that kind of summarizes the film. Day and Night's kind of a weird entity, and it's far more intellectual than a lot of their works, and I think it gets away with it better than Bounden because it proves everything with action and then has this radio thing that's also integrated into the action that also summarizes the moral of the thing. So I think that's primarily the strength of not using dialogue, is that you get lessons via action as opposed to via spoken word. Yeah, Trevor.
When you were, doing research and talking to people, did you ever hear anyone comment on how some people are kind of bemoaning the death of hand-drawn animation? Obviously, there's no reason Pixar needs to hold it up as well, but they have kind of begun the trend that made it go downhill.
Yeah. Not to the people I've talked to, but it came up in my research. So when Lasseter and Catmull went to Disney Animation, one of the first films they released was The Princess and the Frog. So they admit that they love hand-drawn animation. That's where their influences come from. That's where Lasseter started. That's where a lot of their artists start. But the problem is they released Princess and the Frog, and it didn't make enough money, and therefore they switched to computer animation. And it's just one of the ones where it's just the kind of terrible financial reality where it's nice that usually the business side of Pixar doesn't hugely affect the quality of its films because it's kind of in their ethos. But this was one where they were kind of like, we cannot make these anymore because it's so expensive and people aren't going to come out and see it. But what's interesting is kind of looking at some of the reactions to Princess and the Frog, because a lot of it was an issue of timing and marketing, and there are a lot of reasons for it not to make money other than it being hand-drawn. So I would not be surprised if it is not dead, if there will be a resurgence, including that a lot of foreign films that are coming here and highly respected are still hand-drawn, but sadly they just don't get as big an audience.
One more.
One more?
I need lemonade.
Did you look at any of the past Disney or Warner Brothers short films while researching, and which ones did you look at? And also, which ones did you think influenced Pixar the most?
Okay, so I looked at a lot of them, so I can't say all of them. But there are two primary series I looked at, which were the Silly Symphonies and Warner Brothers Looney Tunes. But I think the best example I can give you is I went to an exhibit on Chuck Jones, which actually has John Lasseter introducing a bunch of shorts for the exhibit and talking about their influence on Pixar. It's a very convenient find. But there's a film called, there's The Dot and the Line, which is a really cool one. It is that's more experimental. There's a film, and I cannot think of the title, but I can describe it really quickly, that actually has a direct homage in a Pixar film, which is this film, Looney Tunes, about a dog and a cat, and they're fighting, but at one point the dog somehow thinks that the cat was baked into cookies, and he completely gets crestfallen and gets really sad, and then it turns out the cat was fine. But if you remember in Monsters, Inc., at one point, Sully thinks that Boo has been put into a trash compactor. Which I realize sounds really dark when you describe it. But he thinks, and then he comes out totally crestfallen, and that is a direct homage to that. They admit to that. So you see a lot of it. There's the opening sequence to Dumbo. Comes across in Partly Cloudy, which is my favorite Heart film, where it's the idea of storks bringing baby animals to new mothers, and Partly Cloudy kind of takes that idea and runs with it, and thinks about what would happen if a storm cloud made animals, and then what if that storm cloud had a friend, and yeah, go watch the film. But those are the kind of the direct influences I saw.
Okay, well, Lily, thank you so much.